Hi, hello, 'tis I, Julian Greystoke. I'm back to finally talk about more writing-related things. That's exciting. I'm a published author. You can check out my books for sale on Amazon right now. I have 3 fantasy books that you can check out to see how you feel that I do at writing fantasy. And also, I am a freelance developmental editor, so if you're worried that you've done any of these things but don't know how to identify it, I might be able to help you out. So let's talk about mistakes that newbie fantasy writers make. Now, to be clear, there is nothing wrong with being a newbie. Everybody starts out there. Everybody. There are no exceptions. You don't automatically get a pass because you've watched a lot of fantasy movies or something. Everybody starting out is susceptible to making some newbie mistakes. I made newbie mistakes. That author that you love made newbie mistakes. We all just learn, we all grow, we keep writing, and we look to people like critique partners, beta readers, and developmental editors to help us find our mistakes and root them out. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just a few things that I have noticed, both as a developmental editor and someone who reads fiction in general, and has done a lot of critique in my days. Let's talk about some newbie mistakes that I have noticed when people start out writing fantasy. This is in no particular order. This is just the order that I thought of them. So like the last one is not worse than all of the others or anything like that. So number 1, we have info dumping about your world and lore. I've seen this a lot of times where the beginning author will be so excited to tell you all about their world building that they just start the book with that, and they just dump just world building info onto you, the reader. Now, many people who read fantasy love the world building, but we want to get to it through the characters. In pretty much every case, like I'm certain there are exceptions, but in pretty much every case, you are going to want to start out your story with the character and bring out the world building through the character's experiences and knowledge, at least to get you rolling, instead of just dumping a bunch of stuff that you think is cool, but we have no reason to think it's cool yet because we're not experiencing it. We didn't come here to read a textbook about your imagination. The next one is forgetting to give your main character a personality. Now, I've seen this with both male and female characters, but I do tend to see it more with the guys. So watch out for this. I see a lot of what I would call handsome bricks out there in the fantasy world whose main job is to just be good looking and heroic. Now, we also have this with the female characters. They tend to get the archetype of badass and nothing else. So remember that your character cannot just be one thing. Figure out their likes, their dislikes, what makes them angry, what makes them sad, what makes them happy. We need to know all of those things for a complete and well-rounded character. It can't just be, they are the hero, they are heroic, or she is a sassy badass, nothing else. A lot of times people will accidentally give way more personality to the side characters than they give to their main character. I'm not 100% certain why this phenomenon happens, but it certainly does, so watch out for it. Possibly, now this is just my theory, it's because you as the author spend so much time with your main character that you kind of assume that the knowledge that you have is somehow common knowledge and their personality is coming through when it is in fact definitely not. My next mistake that newbie writers make is having an all-powerful main character or one with a titanium character shield. Now, to be clear, you guys all know that I hate the special. The character who just gets the most of everything. She's the last of her kind. She turns out that she's a lost princess. She's the only one who has these powers, and she gets 2 dragons. Okay, that's not my favorite archetype, but if that's the kind of person you want to write, that's okay. The problem is when people forget to give them flaws. And no, being clumsy or having a little bit of a temper do not count as flaws. There's also the titanium character shield, where every time you send your main character into a dangerous situation, they handily get out of it without any trouble, or barely injured, or if they do get injured, it's healed right away and they don't ever have to deal with it. Your main character should make mistakes, they should fail sometimes, oftentimes, they should get injured and it should have consequences. You need to do these things or your main character's not going to be relatable. Even if they are the special, they still need to do those things. The next mistake that newbie writers make is taking too long to get to the plot. Remember that you do need to have a plot in your fantasy story. I know that it's fun to dig into all the world building and have fun watching the character go about their day, but we do need to know what the plot is, whether it's a big bad coming to kill them or it's something as simple as they're trying to run a coffee shop. We need to know what goal we are working towards. Even if you can give the reader some hint before you go back into the world building or watching the character go about their day, that's fine, but we gotta get to the plot. We gotta get to the plot ASAP. Just because it's a fantasy book doesn't mean you can take forever to get to the plot. The next mistake that I see a lot of newbie writers making writing fantasy is trying to mimic older writing styles. I have seen so many authors trying to be like Tolkien, or trying to write in these very eloquent, prosy, flowery, purple styles, and a lot of times if you're a newbie, you don't have the skills, and so you just end up sounding like you're really pretentious, you don't actually know what you're talking about, or you wrote the entire book with a thesaurus open next to you. This can lead to a lot of very flowery descriptions of place without remembering that characters and actions are important, and a lot of times I've noticed with this style that actions get left by the wayside, and sometimes even dialogue. In the world of fantasy, things are ever changing, and just because you read some really popular older fantasies doesn't mean that that's the kind of book you have to write. And in fact, you probably shouldn't, especially when you're just starting out. The next mistake that newbie writers make is having a bloated or overloaded cast. Now here's the thing. Fantasy books can be huge and they can have a lot of characters. And I'm sure you've read fantasy books with so many characters. Wheel of Time comes to mind. But when you are starting out with your first ever fantasy book, you probably don't want to have too big of a cast, at least not right away. Because the more characters you add, the more work you are making for yourself as an author. It's hard mode, baby, and you probably don't want to start out in hard mode. It's like a video game. When you first start out, maybe, you pop it in medium just to see. So consider chopping or combining some of those side characters, because I've got many that says that you don't need all of them. The next mistake that a lot of fantasy newbie writers make is trying to do too much or be too complex. I see this so often. You have so many ideas for your first fantasy book. You're so hyped. You've been waiting so long to do all of these things, but it's too many things. Like we just talked about with hard mode, when I'm editing for someone, I might say something like, hey, the direction you're taking your book, you're setting yourself up for a real challenge. Now that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, but I do want you to go ahead with an understanding of the challenge that you're really setting up for yourself. So I really encourage you, as you're starting your first fantasy book, to think about a couple of big elements that you really want to use and explore, and maybe save some of the rest of your cool ideas for your next book. It's okay to set some aside. You don't have to throw anything away. And I know when you're first starting out, it's daunting to think, I have to write more books before I can use this cool idea that I have. But trust me, once you get going, if being an author is for you, you're gonna want to write more books. You're gonna get to the end of the first one and be like, that was great. When do I do another? Yeah, sure, there's gonna be torturous parts. I understand the fear when you're starting out that like, what if I only have one book in me? Trust. You probably don't, so save some of these cool ideas and don't try to cram them all into one book. Because even if this does turn out to be your only book, do you want it to be overcrowded and clumsy because you didn't have the skills to deal with all of the elements that you wanted to put in? Probably not. Here's another mistake that a lot of newbie writers make when they're writing fantasy, and that is a useless prologue. Now, you guys know that I feel pretty strongly about prologues, and I feel that 90% of the time they do not need to be there. Very seldom have I encountered a prologue where I went, well, damn, we needed that prologue. It does happen from time to time. But the main perpetrators I have found of the most useless prologues are authors starting out. A lot of times when you're first writing fantasy, you kind of use your prologue as a place to like idea dump, and it ends up being completely useless because all of that information you get in the book later. So consider just skipping the prologue and starting at the beginning, and then later when you finish the book, see if you feel like you need a prologue, rather than starting your entire writing process with a prologue. My next mistake is not considering modern day language. Now this one, a little bit more of a pet peeve of mine, and some people are fine with writing modern language into their fantasy books. But personally, I try to avoid it, especially turns of phrase that do not make sense in your fantasy world. Like, let's say you're in a low technology fantasy world and somebody says, pedal to the metal. What the heck does that mean? So watch out when you're writing for modern slang, modern phrases that you yourself are so used to hearing that you think that they have existed for all of time. But they really haven't. They reference something that probably doesn't exist in your fantasy world. The same thing for your gods and your religion. This is something that people forget about a lot. But if you're gonna have your character say, oh my god, that implies the existence of God. So think about that and how you want your characters to speak in reference to, like I said, those common turns of phrase. And my final mistake for you all to watch out for as you start writing fantasy is borrowing too many ideas. Yeah, we've been seeing it more and more lately, I've noticed, especially in YA fantasy, where all of them just kind of seem to be copy-pastes of each other. It's perfectly fine to borrow ideas, or better still, jump off of ideas. You really shouldn't take an idea wholesale from one book and put it into another book. But jumping off of ideas is fine. Like, say you want to have your story take place in a dragon school. Perhaps you should take your dragon school in a radically different direction instead of making it just exactly like the dragon school in Fourth Wing. Watch out for taking an idea that you love and just using it wholesale in your book, unless you're writing a fan fiction.
I lied to you. I have one more that I thought of while I was editing. So here is my actual final newbie mistake that fantasy writers make, and that is treating your book as though it is a TV show or a movie. I've been seeing this more and more lately, even in traditionally published things, where the author treats a scene as though it's a TV or movie scene and it just stops. Or they forget to describe things because it's as though they think that there is some kind of screen that's going to show you what's happening. Something else I noticed from newbies that I've critiqued for in the past is a lot of scenes of just back and forth dialogue, which could be a lot more interesting if we were watching it on a screen with a couple of actors, but not actually that interesting if we're just reading dialogue, especially if we don't know the characters super well. So remember that books are a separate medium from TV and movies, and just because you've seen a lot of fantasy TV and movies doesn't necessarily mean that's going to translate well into books. So probably make sure that you're also reading fantasy books, reading contemporary fantasy books, meaning fantasy books that were written somewhat recently if you're interested in being published, and seeing how skilled authors are transitioning their scenes, are dealing with lots of dialogue, are showing the action, versus just treating it as though you are writing a script or a screenplay, which is a common mistake I've been seeing more and more lately.
So there you go. All those were my thoughts of things that you should watch out for if you are starting out writing fantasy. Have you done any of these things? Have you corrected any of these things? Did you just realize that you were doing these things? Comment below and let me know. And like I said, absolutely no shame if you have done or are doing any of these things. We call these common mistakes for a reason. And just because these might be mistakes for some people doesn't mean that somebody else couldn't turn them into something beautiful. So if you're doing one of these things but it's really working super well for your book somehow, like maybe you can make it your own. But generally, just be on the lookout for this stuff.
Also, if you've made it this far, you've probably already written this in the comments, but just in case, you may be tempted to go down and point out where this famous published author did this or that thing that I mentioned in this video. And yes, people can make any of these things work because in writing there are no hard and fast rules. It's just better to maybe not consider yourself the exception when you're just starting out. You're literally just learning to do this thing. You're literally just gaining these skills. So give yourself a break and maybe just don't try to make these things work like the professionals maybe can.
If you want to see how well I did with my books, like I said, you can check them all out, available now on Amazon. I also have a Patreon, so if you like what you see here, you can support me over there and get exclusive content not seen here on the regular channel. And also, I am a developmental editor, like I talked about. So if you are concerned that your book is doing any of these things and you don't know, like sometimes it's really hard to tell and you need a professional to look at it, I could be that professional. It can be really daunting to try to find yourself an editor in this day and age, but I'm right here. You already know me. So check out my Fiverr and see if we'd be a good fit. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see all of you again next time with whatever it is I happen to be doing next time. Bye!
Have fun storming the castle.
Think it'll work?
It would take a miracle. Bye-bye.
My patrons and I always have fun storming the castle. Patrons like Sarah, Lisa, Amanda, Jenny, Savvy, Scribbling Cat, Rennie, Jesper, Zaire, Shelby, Ray, Callison, Anne Sophie, Patrick, Belle, Light Julie, Hidden Glade, Kit, Merween, Sophia, Ashley, Swamp Goblin Waifu, Melissa, Afra, Deborah, Rita, Alyssa, Celia, Amanda, Lafone, KJ, Jessica, Caitlin, Ursula, Robin, Jojo Bookish, Bear, Kirsten, Maria Mooney, Kohikaro, Kira, Sam, Haley, Julius the Nice Dragon, Pansing Pony, Roma, Veda, 78 Kilograms of Shade, Kat, Sarah M, Nico, Sunny Shy, Bird Anonymous, July, Martha Baggins, SB Boots, and Ruin, Queen of Oblivion.